Welcome to Real Clear Politics on SiriusXM's POTUS.
Welcome to Real Clear Politics on SiriusXM for Friday, February 14th, Valentine's Day. I'm Tom Bevan, co-founder and president of RCP, joined by Carl Cannon, our Washington bureau chief, and Phil Wegmann, our White House correspondent. So, gentlemen, let's start with J.D. Vance. He spoke at the Munich Security Conference today and gave, I think, what could be described as a blistering speech, talking about, he started by saying he wanted to talk about our shared values, and then he upbraided all of the folks in the room about the constraints that have been put on free speech around across Europe. He got into them on immigration as well, so much so that the German defense minister got up afterwards and basically denounced J.D. Vance's speech and said this is unacceptable, and got a decent amount of applause for that. So, Phil, let me ask you, start with you on this. This was quite remarkable for J.D. Vance to be this sort of forward and aggressive, but again, this is a new Trump administration, and they definitely feel, I think, they're definitely a little bit more aggressive in their stances and their policy positions.
And if you're going to be blistering, you have to be accurate. The thing that jumped out to me from Vice President Vance's speech in Munich is that his criticism over free speech is something that we've seen for about a decade at this point. He wasn't reaching for examples. Instead, they were easily at hand. And the message seemed to be, wait a minute, we won the Cold War. And yet at the end of it, we see more censorship. We see sort of a slippery slope towards tyranny. The speech reminded me in part of the address that Donald Trump delivered at the United Nations, but it was more substantive than that UN speech in that, you know, Vance, he was castigating them, but he was also pointing to an ideal, which has, you know, fallen to the wayside. And I'm not surprised also that, you know, we saw the German chancellor stand up in protest. I'm curious, though, what their recourse is at a moment when Donald Trump is not just promising individual tariff portfolios. He's promising all of those European nations that the tariffs are going to be reciprocal. So, you know, this was a new regime, and this was also a new messenger. As J.D. Vance's political career continues, this is going to be a speech that is referenced.
Certainly. Carl, one of the things that seemed to really rankle the Europeans was J.D. Vance talked about, you know, we say we're doing all these things in the name of democracy, and yet in a lot of places across Europe, and he cited a few examples, that Europeans are oftentimes doing things to thwart the will of their constituents. Whether he mentioned immigration, he mentioned Brexit in that passage, and the Europeans sort of took umbrage to that and took offense to the fact that he was suggesting that somehow the EU was more like an authoritarian regimes than the democracies that they claim to be.
Well, when you go and get a group of people together, sit them down and say, you all suck, basically, there's going to be some pushback and some people who are going to think, you know, we don't really suck that bad. But this is an interesting thing. So, you know, we forget how young this administration is. It's February 14th. They came in office on January 20th. Vice presidential nominees and vice presidents have played a historical role in American politics of being the attack dog. And not always, but it's sort of understood on the campaign trail in America. And Vance seems to have taken that now, you know, international. And it was a little jarring. I like Phil, though, what he said may have been undiplomatic. I'm not sure it was untrue. The context, by the way, for German resentment is not just tariffs and also being told you suck. It's also Ukraine. And, you know, Donald Trump insisted when he was president the first time that the NATO partners had been reneging for decades on their responsibility. Basically, there's some wiggle room, but, you know, just roughly spend 2% of your gross national product on defense. And they hadn't been. Well, they are now. And so Trump's response when he comes in office the second time is, oh, by the way, that's not enough, 2%. We want more than that. And they've been hearing these rumblings about Ukraine, where J.D. Vance and Pete Hegseth and Donald Trump have been sort of murmuring about, you know, about how this peace will look not very favorable to Ukraine, and I think they resent that. So that's the context of this. But on the free speech part of it, I think Vance is sincere about that. You'll remember this, both of you, in his debate with Tim Walz during the campaign. Walz basically saved his best shot for last. He didn't have a strong debate, but at the end he said, are you still a election denier? And if you are, you should deny that. And democracy. Walz's point was democracy can't really succeed if the losing side won't accept the outcome of election. Vance's response to that, he parried that, and he said, we've talked about this before on our podcast. He basically said, well, this Democratic regime doesn't believe in free speech anymore. And he suggested that's a bigger threat to democracy. So that's this, as Phil said, there's a context here. And I think this debate's going to continue.
Phil, one of the lines from the speech that, is getting a lot of attention is this joke that he told where he said, basically, it's pretty, again, I think he kind of knew that the joke was going to fall flat, but he said it anyway, right? This idea, he said, listen, and he said, he prefaced it by saying, I say this with humor, but, if we can take 10 years of scolding by Greta Thunberg, you can take you guys can survive a couple of months at Elon Musk. And you can tell the room just kind of, there was no clapping, there was no laughing. I thought it was funny. And as I said, I thought it was pretty ballsy of him to kind of make not just the content of the speech itself, but the joke, but didn't really go over in the room as even he expected.
The Europeans have no sense of humor, and I'm curious if they have any culture left. I mean, or really a sense of gratitude. I mean, the United States has saved that continent at least twice over. We're keeping the lights on in Ukraine currently. It's difficult to point to a single sick man of Europe anymore. It seems to be the entire continent. They are not leading the way globally. Instead, they seem to be caught in a larger power struggle between the United States and China. And the real disappointing thing here is, what European discernment is there? Did they think that J.D. Vance was joking? Did they think that Donald Trump wasn't serious this time around? They could laugh at Trump during his first term. All right, he's outlandish and kind of boorish. But, to Cannon's point, Vance and Trump have been saying this thing for some time. They should have expected it. They should have prepared. And if that means that they have to take their lumps at their fancy little conference, so what?
All right, Carl, let's bring things back closer to home, because the latest in the struggle over the size and scope of the government, the battle taking place in Washington, is news that the Trump administration has ordered all of the folks who are basically on their probation, people, I guess, who've been in the job for less than a year, to be fired. And that could be up to 200,000 people, according to some estimates. We've talked about this on the program, and you've repeatedly said, we talked just the other day, I think 75,000 or so people have taken the buyouts. There's real anxiety in Washington, and people who are losing their jobs are real people, and they've got families and all of that. Is this latest news just more of the same from your view inside the Beltway?
Well, yes, but this latest purge is going to extend beyond the Beltway, because it's federal workers who are not just here. It's federal workers, national parks and around the country, and other agencies. This idea that you would take 200,000 people who are, quote, on probationary status. That's when the federal government hires you. It's so hard to fire a civil servant. They want to make sure they didn't get a bad apple. These people aren't really on probation. That's what this is about. These are people who've taken jobs. Many of them have come to Washington. They've moved. They've left their job in the private sector. They've bought a house. They've rented a house, whatever they've done. And to suddenly be told you lose your job in an email from some algorithm, it seems like. And then, at some of these agents at the Small Business Administration, if you need help or you want to know more, call this number. It was a number of some hotel in Washington. I mean, it's being done so haphazardly and so capriciously that it starts to feel cruel. And I don't, Donald Trump ran and he said he was going to do X, Y, and Z. He didn't say he was going to do this. He didn't say he was going to fire 200,000 people for no reason whatsoever. And this is not, it's a pretty stark way to downsize a company. And I guess Elon Musk had success doing this at Twitter, but that doesn't seem to me to that should be the guiding lesson here.
So, Phil, outside the Beltway, though, there was a story in Axios today which caught my attention. They completed a focus group of swing voters in Arizona. It's 11 people, so it's not a huge sample, but nevertheless, it's 11 people who are quote unquote swing voters. They voted for Joe Biden in 2020. They switched their vote to Trump in 2024. Arizona is obviously a swing state, a battleground state. All 11 of them were supportive of Donald Trump's what he's done in office thus far. Most of them were supportive of Elon Musk and the way he's gone about aggressively attacking the size and scope and wasteful spending, et cetera, et cetera. So, inside the Beltway, there's one view, but outside the Beltway, and again, this focus group, it was probably conducted before this latest round, but nevertheless, I mean, over the last 3 weeks, the view outside the Beltway seems to be pretty positive toward Trump and Musk and what they've been trying to do.
That's right. And I think that looking at that type of focus group and the fact that Donald Trump's polling at a better point than he has previously, that's why this administration is moving so quickly. We've seen reporting about Stephen Miller saying that they want to flood the zone. Elon Musk wants to move quickly. And I think that's because they want to make the most of this honeymoon period or premium that the president has here. And what they're doing really, I think Cannon used the right word, is it is a purge. You have some of the critics of the administration saying that these firings are not going to put a dent in the deficit. And that's true. I mean, the dollars and cents here, that doesn't really add up when we're $36 trillion in debt. But there's two purposes here. The first is an efficiency question. Elon Musk, I think, in his own mind, is serious about cutting away what he sees as some of the rot. But the second thing is, these Republicans, they see this as their moment to root out of these institutions that favor Democrats and liberals, sort of the infrastructure. And so that's exactly what they're doing right now. And they're going to continue doing it as long as the public gives them leeway.
Look, running trillion-dollar deficits in peacetime, which is what Barack Obama and Joe Biden did, and Trump came close, is obscene. We shouldn't do it. But who did that? Congress did that. Democrats and Republicans in Congress. These three presidents, Barack Obama, Joe Biden, Donald Trump, they did that. To use the federal government as a scapegoat, these federal employees as a scapegoat, seems to me to be so manifestly unfair, and I'll use that word again, capricious, that I expect in time the polling will change on this. We can revisit this in a few months, but and even if it doesn't, that it polls well doesn't make it right.
All right. We're going to take a quick break, and we'll be back with more Real Clear Politics on SiriusXM right after this.
It's real, it's clear, and it's on POTUS.
It's Real Clear Politics.
SiriusXM 124.
Covering the news fairly and honestly.
You're listening to Real Clear Politics on SiriusXM's POTUS, Channel 124.
Welcome back to Real Clear Politics on SiriusXM. I'm Tom Bevan, co-founder and president of RCP. Talking with Carl Cannon, our Washington bureau chief, and Phil Wegmann, our White House correspondent. So, Phil, you had a story, an exclusive on Real Clear Politics this morning, detailing Josh Hawley, the Republican senator from Missouri, his new plan to pass some pro-labor reforms. Give our listeners and viewers a quick rundown of what he's got in the works.
So what the Hawley bill does is it requires organized labor and the employer to get to a first contract or at least begin negotiations within 10 days. Unions have often complained that they will organize, and yet it takes them more than a year to begin negotiations with the employer. This is Hawley trying to mandate a fix to something that labor has been frustrated with for a long time. But if you zoom out a little farther, it's more interesting than member of Congress introduces legislation. Instead, Hawley is trying to solve for something that John McLaughlin, Trump's pollster, told me when they were still sweeping up the confetti on election night. McLaughlin says, look at this coalition that Trump has put together, disgruntled Democrats, union members, working class folks who aren't normally inclined to vote Republican. And he says the GOP is just renting them. Hawley is looking at this and saying, how do we keep these folks in the Republican fold? How do we convince union voters to stick around? And in my conversations with the Teamsters and some other pro-union folks, they see this type of legislation as doing exactly that. And already it has some Democratic co-sponsors. You've got Cory Booker, who has promised to sign on, Gary Peters of Michigan. This is Hawley, a heterodox Republican's attempt to really put a down payment on those not traditionally normal Republicans, keep them in the fold. This is his project. And, as we report in the story, he's got Trump's blessing.
Carl, what about this? I mean, Hawley's a conservative. There's no question about that. But suddenly, he is taking stances, and this bill in particular that is very sort of traditionally Democratic, pro-union, pro-labor. Is that
we don't
wise on his part? Is it going to accomplish what he wants to accomplish, which is to make these voters, a permanent part of the GOP coalition?
Well, that's the big story. But if it does, you're talking about a real realignment of the two political parties, Tom. And that's their goal, is to make what happened in November 2024 lasting. I won't say permanent, but last for a while. And obviously, Donald Trump is thinking along these lines. You look at his labor secretary that he appointed, who's defended her and who's touted her, Elizabeth Warren. And Phil points out in his story, this Josh Hawley bill is one, you think it came from Bernie Sanders. So I don't know if it's going to pass. If it does, it'll be a bipartisan bill. There are some Republicans who won't go for it. But this idea that working class people are going to be brought in, Ronald Reagan kept them in the party for a long time. This is Reagan Democrats 2.0. This is saying we're the party of working people. The other thing is that Trump's being sued by all these unions, but they're public employee unions, not private sector unions. And what this administration is trying to do is what Republicans have tried to do for a long time. Say, we're not necessarily anti-labor. We just don't think public employees union. We're for the steel workers. We're for the AFL-CIO. That's the other. They're trying to drive a wedge between the public and private unions. That hasn't been done yet. And this would be an interesting development if they could do that.
Phil, we got just a couple of minutes left, but that was one thing that jumped out at me from the story, was this talk about Trump's nominee for labor secretary, Lori Chavez-DeRemer. She's a former Democrat. A lot of Republicans, were kind of upset at that pick. They didn't like this pick. And Hawley says in the story, I think she'll be terrific. That was eye-opening.
So Hawley is a little farther along in his conversion on this question than other Republicans. The opposition to Chavez-DeRemer is that she, as a member of Congress, supported the PRO Act, which of course would prohibit some of these state right-to-work laws. Well, as Rand Paul is saying, this is a non-starter for her, and says that she could lose as many as 15 Republican votes. Hawley has already said that he opposes right-to-work laws. So, he might be more comfortable with this, and she might be a nominee that actually does get, wide bipartisan support. But not to rain on the parade here, I think that while, this play from Republicans is smart, there still is a question of whether or not workers are going to believe Trump when he's palling around with Jeff Bezos, with Elon Musk, folks who are no friends of unions, when he's fired folks from the National Labor Relations Board, when he's being sued by public sector unions. That labor secretary nominee, she's the counterexample to all of that. So it's sort of some internal contradictions there, and it's going to be fascinating to cover as we figure out, what Republicans are going to do to avoid going back into the wilderness.
Carl, I'm going to give you the last word, but we only got 30 seconds, and I know it takes you about 2 minutes to clear your throat. The point of this, though, is that Donald Trump's no longer going to be around. This is about the future of the Republican Party that's coming up pretty darn quickly.
Well, that's right. And so, we need to know where J.D. Vance is going to be on this. I can imagine a scenario where he's the tie-breaking vote. You start to think after Trump, who are the people? Donald Trump, J.D. Vance, Josh Hawley wants to be in that conversation, and that's partly what this is about.
And we know where the vice president is, because I asked him this summer on the labor question. I asked him about right to work. He was agnostic, but he said that the job of the administration was to make the life of unions easier, not harder.
All right. Well, Phil gets the last word. All right, we are going to leave it there. I'm Tom Bevan. We'll be back with more Real Clear Politics on SiriusXM after this.
Online at RealClearPolitics.com.
On air on SiriusXM Channel 124.
Real Clear Politics is on POTUS. Not bound by any left-right constructs.
Real Clear Politics. Open to a wide political spectrum.
This is POTUS on SiriusXM Channel 124.
Welcome back to the show. I'm Carl Cannon, Washington Bureau Chief of Real Clear Politics. Talking now with Jonathan Turley, George Washington University law professor and frequent commentator on American public life, especially the First Amendment, judicial system. He's the author of The Indispensable Right, Free Speech in an Age of Rage. But we talked about that when that book came out, John. I want to revisit that and see what the reaction's been. You know, I like the book and said so. What kind of feedback have you got? And then a little teaser to our listeners and viewers. I want to talk about the book you're working on now.
Well, Carl, it's great to be with you again as one of the great defenders of free speech. And so it's always a pleasure to have this type of dialogue. And the response to the book has been very positive. I'm happy to say I just did a lecture at Stanford University, which has had a great deal of problems with free speech. And I was very gladdened actually to speak with many faculty as part of that lecture that are committed to free speech and want to resume this struggle to try to restore free speech protections in higher education. And as I say in The Indispensable Right, the anti-free speech movement that we're dealing with today really began in higher education in the United States. There are two movements going on. One is a movement that swept over Europe, and that tide has certainly reached our shores. But our own homegrown movement began in higher education and then metastasized in media and government and corporations. But the key here is that if we're really going to make inroads, we're going to have to struggle with the hardest of those silos, which is higher education, to try to bring greater intellectual diversity and free speech protections back to our universities. And even some liberal professors who've been silent for years as their colleagues have been fired and suspended are now beginning to acknowledge that this has gotten to be too extreme, that they have virtually eliminated dissenting voices from faculty. Many departments have virtually no conservatives or libertarians. They are virtually 100% liberal and democratic. And that has an impact on our mission to teach students. But I'm also,
when you think about Stanford, John, I just was remembering this sort of reached its sort of height or maybe nadir at Stanford at the law school when a federal judge is invited there and, basically shouted off the stage, called names. These law students at Stanford who are presumably studying constitutional law think that the heckler's veto is, their birthright. And but it sounds like, I'm curious, is the fever broken? It sounds like you had a different experience at Stanford.
Well, it's hard to say. This was a faculty series, and I don't believe the fever has broken at Stanford. Part of the problem I had with the Stanford incident is not just the incident itself, which was bizarre because you had Judge Duncan there to speak with law students, many of whom would like to clerk for him on the Court of Appeals. And then when he finally asked one of the administrators to step forward, this senior member of the law faculty administration denounced him and said, what made you think you could come and give those views here that are so triggering? And all of our jaws dropped watching that video. Now, she was ultimately let go, but what was disturbing is that after the president and the dean finally said, this is not us, we have to allow for free speech, they did nothing with regard to those students who did it. And indeed, they required all students, including the victims of this, to go through to watch a meaningless video on free speech, which the students mocked. And that was how Stanford responded to one of the most serious violations of free speech in its history. But I have to say that there is a critical change in one respect, Carl, and that is the book talks about, the book really talks about our understanding of free speech through the personalities and periods that helped us form our view of free speech. And one of those periods was indeed one of the most dark, which is the Adams administration. John Adams became a colossal hypocrite. He violated everything he believed in or said he believed in during the revolution and tried to actually punish, even execute his opponents. And Jefferson pardoned all those people, but after all, they were Jeffersonians, but he also went after his political opponents. This election is the first election since 1800 where free speech was one of the major issues. And it had the same response. John Adams was tossed out. Joe Biden was tossed out, and then his surrogate replacement, Harris, was rejected. And in part, the poll showed that free speech was one of the issues that concerned voters. And obviously, the economy was the most important. But that is heartening because some of us who believe, and the premise of the indispensable right is that free speech is a natural right. I reject what I call a functionalist view that we protect free speech because it makes democracy better. It certainly does that, but it's more than that. You can,
Well, you've heard my rap on that. I think free speech created this country, not the other way around. I mean, and you write about this too. The John Peter Zenger case and first free speech case in 1735. Let me do a quick update to our listeners and readers. You're listening to Real Clear Politics on Sirius XM Radio. I'm Carl Cannon, Washington Bureau Chief of RCP, talking now with John Turley, a friend of mine and a friend of the First Amendment, more importantly. John, that's a good time. Jonathan's a law professor at George Washington University. John, you just won the Samizdat Prize given by the Real Clear Foundation. What was that? In case our listeners don't know about that, briefly, what was that like, that experience?
Well, first of all, it was a great honor. I was there with the CEO of X, for example, who was one of the co-recipients. But one of the most memorable aspects was to receive that award from your hands because it means a lot to gather people who have fought for free speech for so long. To remind us that we're not alone. That's the point of this prize, is to, from what I understand, is to show people who have been targeted, who've been canceled, who have struggled for free speech, that there is a community out there. And it's sort of what I found out at Stanford yesterday. After viewing Stanford in such a dim light, it was wonderful to see faculty who get it, who understand how important this fight is. And so Real Clear Politics has always been the most steady champion and friend of free speech. Part of that is not just that it's committed to the values of free speech, but Real Clear Politics has itself been targeted, unreasonably so. And so it's walk the walk. It has fought this fight. So to receive a prize from that organization and from people like you, Carl, is one of the greatest honors of my life.
Well, thank you. That's nice. That's kind of you to say. Let's tease our readers a little bit. Well, before I get to your new book, let me ask you a question about free speech. You say we still have a lot of work to do on college campuses, these elite schools especially. But what about in Washington? We had this election you mentioned, but free speech, censorship, let's use that word, has emerged as a partisan issue. More Democrats favor it than Republicans in polls. More Democratic politicians seem to favor it, under the guise of combating misinformation. They don't call themselves censors, but you know how that works. It's a distinction without a difference, ultimately. Is there any consensus building in the political class that this shouldn't be a partisan issue, that Democrats need to care about free speech just as much as Republicans, which is the way it was, when you and I were young men. Are there winds of change afoot?
Well, the only change I can see is not that the Democratic Party is coming back to free speech. I was raised in a liberal Democratic family in Chicago. I worked for liberal Democrats for much of my life, including people like Ted Kennedy, Mo Udall. And frankly, I don't recognize the party. Free speech used to be the touchstone of the Democratic Party. And then during the Biden administration, it became committed wholly to censorship and speech regulation. That hasn't changed. I think that it's too deeply rooted now in the party. What has changed is they're not talking about it as much. that they realized that they lost the fight with the public. Companies like Facebook have realized that. They had a truly creepy campaign for years where they tried to convince young people to embrace so-called content moderation, and all these very happy millennials saying, hey, they're going to moderate our speech. And it didn't work. It moved the needle a little bit, but not enough. It's hard to get a free people to give up freedom. And it's particularly hard for those of us who believe free speech is a natural right, because you cannot be fully human without being able to project part of yourself in the world around you. So the change has been that they know that it's a loser. The problem is that for the last 4 years, they've created this censorship bureaucracy, this apparatus, and it extends from government to corporations to academia. Those people are not going anywhere. They identify themselves as so-called disinformation experts. The example I used once in testimony was that after the Civil War, the problem we faced was that we had a whole bunch of people who were trained in wiretapping. And when the war ended, there was no employment for wiretappers in the government. They didn't stop being wiretappers. They started to work for private companies. And it led ultimately to the federal law banning wiretapping. You're going to have the same people who are out there now, like Ronan, and they are, still calling themselves disinformation experts. And they're like live torpedoes in the water. They're just looking for places to continue this work.
All right, we've got about 30 seconds left. Just give us a hint of the new book you're working on.
Well, it's another book with Simon & Schuster, and we're still wrestling over the title, but it will be out by the end of the year. And it looks at democracy. Half the book looks backwards at what happened in the American Revolution and how did we define democracy? And the other half looks forward is, can democracy survive in the 21st century? And I'm talking about technological and economic changes. And the book looks historically at a tale of two cities, Philadelphia and Paris, and why one went from violence in the streets of Philadelphia to a stable democracy, and the other turned into the terrors and mass executions. And what we could learn from that on the anniversary, the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence.
So you'll come back on my show? We talk about that book when it's published?
I would love to, Carl.
All right. Thank you. You've been listening to Jonathan Turley, law professor at George Washington University, and a great defender of the First Amendment and free speech and free expression in all its forms. I'm Carl Cannon, Washington Bureau Chief of RCP. You've been listening to Real Clear Politics on SiriusXM Radio.
This is Real Clear Politics on POTUS, SiriusXM Channel 124.
Honest reporting and an authentic picture of public disclosure. This is Real Clear Politics on POTUS, SiriusXM 124.
Welcome back to Real Clear Politics on SiriusXM. I'm Tom Bevan, co-founder and president of RCP, joined now by my good pal John Kass, formerly of the Chicago Tribune, now the sole proprietor of his own website, johnkassnews.com. Mr. Kass, good to see you.
Thanks, Tom. Thanks for the plug, and good to see you, sir.
Absolutely. Well, listen, I want to get you on to talk about the news this week that Mike Madigan, the former Speaker of the Illinois House, longest-serving Speaker in Illinois history, it was something like 40-something years, was convicted this week on, 10 counts of conspiracy to commit bribery and wire fraud. He was found not guilty on 7 other counts, and I think there were 6 other counts. There was 23 counts total, and I think he was found guilty on 10 of them.
The federal government, when they want you, they'll throw everything at you. And Mike Madigan had no more place to hide. Friends of his years ago, I remember you and I talking about this years ago. Friends of his, long time ago, said, Mike, you've got more money than Midas, more money than God. Why are you doing this? Why are you doing this? You're going to put a target on your back. He's like, okay, what do I do if I don't do this? He became the man. Mike Madigan became the job. That's all he was. He was identified as Speaker of the House. The last longest Speaker was Mr. Silver, who died going to prison or in prison in New York. Right. And that wasn't even anywhere near as long as Madigan.
But my question for you, John, is, why did it take this long because, you've written about for decades the Illinois, the combine, right?
Yeah.
It's the Republicans and the Democrats, and they work together, and it's all about patronage, and there's a lot of corruption in the state and the city. And certainly, Mike Madigan was at the epicenter of that for decades. And yet no one ever laid a glove on him at all. And then, so why did it take this long, and why did it happen now?
It took this long because the entire state is corrupt. Okay. I'm sure even the Little League baseball is corrupt. You're a resident of this state.
I coached Little League baseball. Our league was not corrupt, John.
We had the world champions from Illinois it was a corrupt thing that when they remember there was a group from the South Side of Robbins, they won, and it was full of fraud. So yeah, we even cheated in Little League, for God's sake.
But did he get lazy? Did he get because again, he made tons of money. I mean, as a legislator and then running a law firm that scooped up a bunch of business. He had massive conflicts of interest the whole time he was in office, did he not?
Yes, he did. He should have been charged decades before, but he wasn't.
And what do you attribute that to? Just judges looking the other way, prosecutors? I mean,
I think the U.S. Attorney's Office in the past was like, Mike Madigan, you're corrupt, but so are we, and the Republicans are corrupt, and let's just leave it alone. And then they had to finally pick him up. John Deutsch went after him, and they got him. There's no sense, at least among people who are bright, that Illinois has changed. Just because you've got this old man's head on your pike doesn't mean you've belled the cat.
Well, that was going to be one of my questions. Is this a new dawn, turning on the page in Illinois? That's ridiculously naive of me.
Yes, it is. But you're just doing that you're just asking that for effect because I know you.
Well, no, I actually wanted to.
Illinois.
I've lived here now longer than I've lived anywhere in my life. I was born on the West Coast, but I've been Midwesternified, as I like to say, and I consider myself now a resident,
sure,
Illinoisan, if you will. But so give our listeners and our viewers, though, John, a sense of just how. I mean, I don't think people understand how powerful this guy was and how one man came to hold so much power in, a pretty big state. I mean, he had an absolute iron grip.
Why was he powerful? Because he was not lazy. I mean, when you think of the Irish Catholic work ethic, that was Mike Madigan. Young boy, you can see it like in Horatio Alger stories. The young boy, the clerk, working hard, trying to impress the boss, rising up step by step in the great corporation. That was Mike Madigan. Okay, for example, Richard Daley, the real mayor, Richard Daley, not the fake one, the son, but the real Richard,
the father,
was probably the most powerful mayor in the history of our country and the most powerful mayor in Illinois, at least in Chicago. He'd get to work at 6 o'clock and begin working literally, and needed his aides there early, like to administer the city. Because unlike the buffoon who's the mayor now, he actually knew how the city worked. Mike Madigan would show up at 6 o'clock at City Hall, ready to do whatever the mayor needed. And when the mayor Daley asked him, Mike, what about this? What about that? If he asked him a question and Mike Madigan didn't know, you know what he would do? An amazing thing. He would say, I don't know, sir. Now, how many times you're an executive now running this huge empire, news empire, how many times have you been told by your people, we got it, we are on it, but they didn't know, and you knew they didn't know, and you were like, oh God, you're grinding your teeth. How many times did that happen? Everybody deals with this in management, in business, and Mike would say, I don't know, and I'll find out, and he did immediately. That's the kind of guy he was. He had his own tree trimming machines in his ward office in the 13th ward on the southwest side. People want their trees trimmed in their parkway, the strip of land between the street and their home.
Yeah.
He would do it. Now, if you asked the city to do it, it would take, 5-6 years? By that time, you had 2 trees,
Right. So he actually would go out and do it himself?
No, he wouldn't. He had the machines, and he'd go out and take care of it.
He had his minions go do it immediately?
Yeah.
So he was smart and he was a hustler.
Detail-oriented.
Mm-hmm.
And he also was profoundly interested. I know this sounds odd because we're talking about his demise and his conviction. Profoundly interested in the rule of law. In this sense, your neighborhood, if you're a criminal, get out of the neighborhood. You don't belong here. And they would use police, state's attorneys, whatever they had to do to get people out of their neighborhood. That's what it was. And now, you see the last few years when he's been weakened and low, the city is collapsing on itself because there aren't people who are detail-oriented. A few are. Maybe you've spoken to them. Like one of the younger people who are old-fashioned in that respect is Ray Lopez, alderman of the 15th Ward.
Mm-hmm. You've had him on your podcast, I know.
Yes, I just had him on the podcast just recently. And he's detail-oriented. But see, politics, as I've learned in my, these 45 years.
You've seen a lot, buddy.
Yeah. Is that detail wins. Detail and a pair of musks, whatever those things are that he talks about.
Well, he certainly managed to accrue just an enormous amount of power. And he was obviously a smart guy and very ambitious and got his daughter elected attorney general of the state.
16 years.
Yeah.
She didn't do anything about the law.
Yeah.
And she didn't do anything about him.
Right. Well, that might have been part of the reason that he wanted her in that position, John.
That's
all right. Listen, we got a couple minutes left, and you did mention the current mayor, so I don't want to let the opportunity pass to have you comment on Brandon Johnson. I mean, his approval rating is, 15%, 14%. I mean, John, if I had told you 3 years ago that in 3 years' time that the city would be pining for the days of Lori Lightfoot, they would just wish her back because she was so much better than the next mayor, you would have laughed, as you're laughing right now, and thought that was the craziest thing you've ever heard.
Here's how bad it is, but you and I have shared conspiracy theories in the past, like the Michelle Obama one that never came to fruition. But here's one. Now that his approval rating is 14%, look for someone to come in to run for the mayor's office. I'm suggesting to you it might be the man with the good hair or bad hair, depending. The one.
Rod Blagojevich?
Think of it. Rod Blagojevich, it's teed up for him. This is how bad it is. Doesn't like the current mayor. Pritzker hates him.
Right.
And they're gonna get rid of him. I don't know what they're gonna do.
You don't think Rahm's coming back for a second go round?
Perfect candidate. I
said you don't think Rahm would be come back for a second go round?
The problem with Rahm is that I would love to see him come back because I could dust off old columns about Mayor Zorro and so forth. But the people of Chicago, Democrats are based on the black vote now. And the black vote turned its back on Rahm Emanuel after he covered up the Laquan McDonald murder. So they'll never forgive him.
All right, John, we got to run, but I will tie this conspiracy commentary in a bow and say Michelle Obama for mayor. How about that?
Then there's no stopping her. Actually, I would like to see. There's so much that I want to see. I want to learn about who official B was, who liked the Asian girls, along with the Danny Solis in the massage parlors. the former the former alderman. There's so much.
Well, we'll have to say that for another time. All right, we got to leave it there. John Kass,
See you.
formerly of the Chicago Tribune, now runs johnkassnews.com. Check it out when you have a chance. John, always good to have you. Thanks.
Thank you, man.
We'll leave it right there. On behalf of Carl and Phil, I'm Tom Bevan, co-founder and president of RCP. Everybody have a great weekend, and we'll see you back here on Monday.
This is Real Clear Politics on POTUS, Sirius XM Channel 124.